Welcome to Glanzrock Trailblazers, an intimate podcast highlighting pioneering women who continue to trailblaze in the world of arts, real estate, politics, and more. I am your host, Cindy Glanzrock, and thanks for joining me. Good day, Meredith Bergmann. It's such a pleasure to meet you over Trailblazer Women's podcasting series about women in the arts, politics, real estate, and more. And it's such a pleasure to meet a trailblazing woman such as you, especially after being in awe of your work in Central Park, specifically the work that was unveiled this past 2020, Women's Rights Pioneers in Central Park on Literary Walk with Katie B. Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Sojourner Truth, or as she used to be called before she became Sojourner Truth, Isabella Baumfree. I look forward to you sharing with us why you might even consider being on this podcast as a trailblazing woman. And maybe we'll start backwards with the most recently unveiled work. Once you tell us a little bit about why are you a trailblazer, even though I put those words in your mouth. Thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you, Cindy. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk with you. And I love the photo you sent me of yourself at the Women's Rights Pioneers Monument. It really has begun to function immediately, and people are using it for political announcements, for mourning public figures like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, all kinds of celebration of women. So it's trailblazing because it's the first statues of real historical women who actually lived, as opposed to Mother Goose or Alice in Wonderland, ever to be erected in Central Park. There are over 120 statues of famous men, no women until 2020.
That's amazing. No women that were real versus men that were real. How come? Because I know there are 29 sculptures, and I believe there are, if I remember accurately, of the 29 sculptures in Central Park, not one of them was real women. They're all allegorical and fictional up until you. What made you make that happen, and why did it not happen sooner? Can you explain that briefly to me and to my audience?
Gladly. I didn't make it happen. A wonderful nonprofit group called Monumental Women organized themselves and basically fought the city bureaucracy for, I think, 4 or 5 years to get that site. And they were denied and repulsed and told, oh, you don't need a statue. How about a nice garden? Maybe in Queens, never mind in the heart of New York City. But they persisted, and they did win this beautiful site where there is kind of a missing monument. So I conceived of my sculpture as the monument these women should have had in their own time. But of course they wouldn't have, because women's achievements weren't considered worthy of that kind of recognition.
Of course.
And now they are, thank goodness. So I applied for the competition. I was a finalist, one of 3 or 4, and I won the competition and then underwent a serious trial by bureaucracy of design and redesign of the monument until it resulted in the sculptures you see there now.
It's interesting you shared that with us. Well, thanks God for, I guess, Mitch Silver, who was our New York City Parks Commissioner at the time.
Yes. He was very supportive.
That's wonderful. And I guess we can also thank Mayor de Blasio, because he addressed the inequity of women not being represented in our city in sculptures. And I recall Betsy Gottbaum complaining quite a few years ago when she was in that position that women had yet to find an honorable place in the city's public statuary. So the first public statue, which is so interesting, of Gertrude Stein, which was in Bryant Park in 1992, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Yes.
Not to have had a public statue of an American woman. That one was actually donated. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that it was donated to the city.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And it's also interesting that Joan of Arc, back in Riverside Park on West 93rd Street back in 1915, was the first woman by a woman, Anne Hyatt Huntington, who also did the Jose Marti sculpture, which is over on Central Park South. Yes. Of a man, of course, of a patriot, yeah. But of a man. But it's most people don't realize women have created sculptures in Central Park. Was that ever, as a little girl, a teenager, as an artist, something surprised by you that women had made sculptures, but they were always of men?
I don't think that really registered. When I came to New York as an art student, the city was headed for bankruptcy. It was the 70s, and the monuments were all incredibly dilapidated. And we didn't study them. It was the heyday of conceptual art. So these were objects made for the power structure, and they were despised. I was, of course, very curious about them, but I didn't realize the depth of my curiosity about figurative sculpture until I started to study it after art school in Italy, at the Art Students League, at a variety of places, doing remedial anatomy, trying to make up for the art education that was unavailable when I was in art school, which was a wonderful experience. Cooper Union, really learning about the conceptual background, the history of art, reasons why art might be made. And that's still a big factor in my work. What's the motivation behind people seeking to memorialize a particular figure? And in what way do they want that figure to be remembered? And how can I fight to have that be part of the story 100 years from now? Because monuments remain, we pass on, new people look at them, and they reinterpret them. They have new meanings. But if we want people to be remembered for the good they did, for instance, as opposed to for their flaws, there may be ways that the sculptor can contribute to that.
Well, hopefully we're not recognizing people for their flaws. We won't go into anything political at the moment, even though that is part of my podcast. We'll stick with art
Yes.
at the moment. But speaking of somewhat meaningful and political, I would say, very much so, is your 9/11 memorial work, which is at Cathedral the St. John Divine, St. John the Divine. I
Mhm.
am asking you about specifically this one because we're going back to the first work that I was familiar with that you had done, which many people don't know about it, where it is and why and how you were chosen. I know you're a little bit about the history of you in terms of you going to Wesleyan and then moving to Parsons and, as you said, Cooper Union. So I guess it was through Cooper Union, then you were starting to live here and spend time here and be part of the city. And I'm sure this memorial was so important to you, but please express that and tell us a little bit about that work. And we do have some slides here, and we're showing the work as we speak so that when we do show it on YouTube or other places where visuals can
Great.
be, we will share those also of your fabulous 9/11 memorial piece from 2001. Please share that, a little bit about that with us.
Well, when I first began to study art, seriously, it was art history that I was studying, and then visiting the Metropolitan Museum, sketching there for hours. And time didn't have a lot of meaning. If there was a powerful image from thousands of years ago, it's powerful now. And so I felt entitled to kind of live in art history as well as in the current day and try to mix them in my work. And my family and I have visited probably about 60 different cathedrals in Europe, mainly, not entirely, a few here. And the art there is in the service of religion. It's extremely powerful and evocative. And I just gravitate towards that. And after 9/11, well, during 9/11, we were living in Manhattan. The smoke was coming into our apartment. It was horrific. We had a very young child then. Our son was little, and he has autism, and we couldn't leave him with a sitter to go help downtown. So I was also overseeing the casting of the 1/3 height model for the Boston Women's Memorial. So I was working on figures the size of, well, 1/3 life size, basically. And I made a figure that size at our living room table out of clay of a woman who kind of symbolized New York City to me, sort of like the Statue of Liberty, but young, tough, very much from the Western tradition, a woman who represented everything that the Taliban would want to destroy. So she had to be nude and unashamed. I was very upset, but she is also absorbing the attack and surviving. And her gesture of the raised hands is from Islamic prayer, and the piercing of the hands is from the Christian religion. So these are a combination of hopefully a monument to a kind of tolerance.
And I see there are planes coming at her hands. So they're Y planes that are torpedoing into her hands.
Well, these are the two jets that attack the two towers, and her arms are kind of the towers. And the cathedral asked me to make a larger version as a memorial. after I exhibited the small memorial in the cathedral.
Tell us about Pinky and why I want to hear about Pinky, which I love the name, and you can explain to us why her name is Pinky. She also was known as Sally Diggs, and I know she's at the Brooklyn Historical Society that used to be called the Center for Brooklyn History in Brooklyn Heights, in a stairwell of all places. I understand she was a slave, and there's an incredibly important story there. Maybe you could share how you were chosen for that, why just the head of Pinky, like a bas relief, who paid for it, and what does it mean to you? Besides the Latin expression, which maybe you could share with us, which I understand means life's teacher or learning from life's experiences. Thank you so much. Please carry on.
Well, like all the sculptures, this is a bit of a long, complicated story because sculpture is slow. So I try to add as many layers to each work as I can. This is one of my favorite works, as is the September 11th memorial, because they came out of my own imagination. It was a combination of a commission and something that I originated. And that's very gratifying. So I was
Yes.
chosen to be an artist in residence at the Brooklyn Historical Society, and the assignment was to work from their archive. But I considered their building part of their archive because I passed that building as an art student living in Brooklyn Heights. And their heads on the outside, giant heads of dead white European culture heroes like Michelangelo and Shakespeare, surrounded by American plants. And the building was beautifully cleaned in the 90s, so you can see all this. And in the archive of the society, of the collection, is the bill of sale of Sally Maria Diggs, who was 9 years old. She was a slave in Washington, D.C. She was 1/16th African American, so she looked white, but she could be sold and bought. And her grandmother was terrified that this would lead to prostitution and contacted Henry Ward Beecher, the most famous man in America, who preached to huge crowds at Plymouth Church in Brooklyn. And he staged an act of political theater that was so successful he did it 6 more times, always with young, white looking, enslaved young women. So he preached his sermon. He had Sally Maria Diggs, who was known as Pinky, I assume because of her complexion, with flaxen hair and a velvet dress, brought out and pretended to auction her to his congregation to buy her freedom. And they threw money and jewelry in the collection plates. They raised enough money to pay, not only to buy her, set her free, and pay for a year of education. And he took the ring out of the plate and said, "This is your ring of freedom." So that's why she's wearing the ring around her neck.
So that was the ring of her freedom. I love that.
Yes. And the plant surrounding her, I had to choose an American plant, and I wanted something symbolic. And I am always looking for something that has some wit in it. And I chose poison ivy, and the explanation is that, like racism, it makes us suffer needlessly for our skin.
Beautifully, even if painfully, explained and representative of what this young lady must have been going through. And thank God for Reverend Beecher. He sort of set her free.
For his own reasons and for his own gain, this whole story is just drenched in irony and double motives, but it is a fascinating and true story from Brooklyn.
Well, I think the accomplishments and your accomplishments of women are extraordinary, hence trailblazing. I want to ask you, before we speak about FDR, which is a meaningful work, how did that end up happening? Speaking of trailblazers, he was quite a trailblazer as a man, and yet you have a young little girl, which I assume is a tribute to overcoming physical barriers with polio, as he did. So can you tell us a little bit about this FDR memorial, which I understood didn't get unveiled until 2021, right before the Women's Rights Pioneers Memorial in Central Park in 2020 during COVID? It's such a touching piece. Can you share that a little bit with us?
Sure. As a public artist, I'm called on to help give form to a group's expression. And this was a very grassroots group, the Roosevelt Island Disabled Association. Roosevelt Island had begun as a place of punishment and quarantine. In the 19th century, there was a huge penitentiary. Then it became more enlightened. There were hospitals for the chronically disabled. It became Welfare Island. Then in the 70s, it became Roosevelt Island. And the whole island is graded for wheelchairs. It was a very inclusive community. And this group at the community board meeting for the $50 million Four Freedoms Park designed by Louis Kahn in the 70s and finally built in the turn of this century at the southern tip of Roosevelt Island. They said, oh, this is great. This is wonderful. Roosevelt is our hero. But where is he below the neck? You know, you've got this giant head of Roosevelt going to be in that park. But where's our hero who, in a wheelchair, became governor of New York and in a wheelchair became president, served 4 terms, saved us from Hitler? You know, where is that body? And they approached me as an artist, and I made models and won their approval. And then gradually we began to navigate the city government. Roosevelt Island is governed by the state. So this project fell between the cracks many times. We couldn't get anyone on the phone. We had a challenge grant. We had a donor. We had I would say most of our budget. Finally, in the late 2000s, the state Roosevelt Island Operating Corporation joined in. The idea of the memorial was to make a space where people of all disabilities would be comfortable. So the benches, the walkways are designed for people who are visually impaired. We hope to have an element for the hearing impaired at some point. And you walk up a timeline that tells this story of the gradual enlightenment of Roosevelt Island to a place that is so welcoming. The story of the polio virus in America and the story of FDR. And then you arrive at these two figures, Roosevelt greeting a kind of typical child with polio, with a leg brace, because he began an institute that helped many, many children. This had a huge personal meaning to me and my family, too. Our son is disabled. He spoke at the unveiling. But polio was considered shameful. No one knew what it caused it. And polio victims were isolated. They were brought home, put in a back bedroom. And of course, they degenerated. They became more feeble minded. People began to say the disease causes the feeble mindedness. It's not true. It's that there was no therapy. And now there is, thanks to FDR.
Well, it's wonderful that your son was there, and I understand he's made great strides, had a wonderful education, even from Harvard, if I
Yes.
recall. You shared that with me. You've both been great parents. I understand you and Michael being supportive parents, and obviously you left New York to be, I understand, supportive parents. And that's a beautiful thing because
Yes.
in part, but trailblazing women is not just about trailblazing specifically in the arts, but as in your personal life too and endeavors. And I guess that was part of what you did when you moved to Massachusetts and had now this beautiful studio and left New York and still was able to receive commissions here because you'll always be a New Yorker, or I should say a New Jersey person, since that's where you're originally from, if I recall.
Yes.
I don't want to forget Eleanor Roosevelt has a beautiful work that was placed in 1996 by Penelope Jenks up in Riverside Park on 72nd Street. And that was a full body work. And it's her being sort of pensive and contemplative and looking very intellectual as she was and has made a big difference in our world. It's
a wonderful sculpture.
So leaping forward, before we do want to touch on before the end of this interview, of course, about wonderful piece that I was so lucky to be photographed in front of, which we'll show some of our fun photos that we took with Sophie Elgort, who photographed me there for Trailblazing Women podcast, is the Gateway to Lexington, I hear, is something in the future. So let's talk about the future versus the past, since you keep on creating and making beautiful things happen. And I love the title of the Gateway to Lexington, Something is Being Done. Is that what I recall it being called? I think you said in spring 2024, we'll be able to see this work if we ever get to Lexington. But tell me a little bit about the 3 women. And then there's, I think you said, one pedestal that will have no women on it. And just explain the whole inspiration.
That was the original concept, that the piece have room for you to participate in it. And I did not want to do statues of 3 women again, having done that in Boston and in Central Park. And I proposed a large 10 feet by 16 feet wide, 10 feet high, a kind of a pierced bas-relief. So it's like a gate. It's like something you would normally see in wrought iron, but this will be modeled in clay, cast in bronze, and it depicts 10 women on one side and then a different 10 women on the other side, and they fit within each other's silhouette. So whatever face and hat the woman is wearing on one side, the other woman is wearing a different version on the other side. And you can walk through this gateway and stop in the center and reach out and touch the hands of the two framing women on either side of the gate. And they include figures like Margaret Tulip, who was a free Black woman in Lexington in the colonial era, who was essentially kidnapped by a local resident who claimed that she belonged to him. And she fought in court, I think for 8 years, and won her lawsuit. And so she's depicting holding the document that says she is in fact a free woman, and then she sued to get her son back. So there were these lawsuits and they could be won. And on the other side is an elderly woman in her 90s marching with a suffrage banner that says something must be done, which was the thing remembered after the Battle of Lexington, which was the first battle of the American Revolution. A mother went to wake her son saying, Jonathan, Jonathan, get up. The regulars are coming, the British soldiers, and something must be done. She was waking him up.
Wonderful.
And the suffragists took this, something must be done. And then that woman gave that banner to the younger suffragists who went to Washington in 1913 to march in huge numbers to try to get the vote, which of course no women got until another 7 years had passed. So it shows the power of these words coming down through history. That's why it's called Something Is Being Done.
Well, it takes a village and it takes a lot of time to build the village and to destroy it. So meaning we see what's happening in the world. I'm sure we understand that it must be very difficult being a Ukrainian right now and seeing what they built and about their lifestyle, and something must be done, I think is really relevant, and something hopefully is being done as we live it every day in our lives.
Well, women's rights in this country are under attack, and we have to be doing something every minute to try to keep the ones we have and get back the ones we just lost and get the Equal Rights Amendment passed and these basic human rights for over half of humanity.
Do you believe, coming from a family, just to change the subject for a moment, a father that was a big historian, and you explained you spent time with him and he was very connected to teaching you or having you engaged, and a mother who was highly educated, went to Wellesley College, I recall, and was involved in the League of Women Voters?
Yes.
So active mother in volunteer work. And also, I guess, somewhat of a suffrage, and went, you said involved with theater also, with the Olympia Theater Company in Montclair. Do you think that has helped you or guided you or given you this energy, enthusiasm, and ambitious way of looking at life and attacking it?
Yes and no. My mother was very smart, in a way very talented, but not an artist. She didn't have that desire. And I had many relatives, some professional singers in my family, but nobody who really wanted to make that commitment to being a professional artist. So I didn't have a role model in that sense. And my father was a lawyer. He didn't much like his work, I don't think. He had some political ambitions that were flouted. And he loved history, but it was mild. It wasn't a kind of daily passion. I discovered all that in the course of getting my piecemeal education and just my own falling in love with 19th century architecture and history over the course of childhood and doing the Boston Women's Memorial. It was the Boston Women's Memorial that taught me that this League of Women Voters, which was one of my mother's passions, was actually the suffrage movement itself after 1920, renamed and turned into an organization to help and agitate women to vote.
Clearly, then, you were the chosen one when it came to this fabulous sculpture of the women's rights pioneers in Central Park, which, we could jump into that. And then I have some other questions that I just want to ask you about the art world a little bit, since I know you have some ideas of what that's been like being part of it or not being part of it. I'd like you to share with people that are curious about the art world besides your own wonderful skills. So please tell us, how did this come to pass? You said it took forever, but it happened. And I saw a wonderful photo with you, with Hillary Clinton, and the president of the Monumental Women.
Yes, Pam Elam.
Pam Elam, where when it was unveiled on that glorious day.
Everybody wearing masks.
Yes.
we could only have 75 people at the unveiling, and we had to call it a press conference because public gatherings were still not legally allowed because of COVID.
My goodness.
So
Well,
there we were, 75 people across from a ridiculous statue of a poet that was unveiled in the park in the 19th century, and 10,000 people were there.
how funny.
But we had a lovely unveiling, and Hillary Clinton gave a marvelous speech. So that was nice.
So it took how many years for you to make this and to unveil it? Tell us the size, if you could share the price.
This was fast, actually. 4 or 5 years to win permission to erect it at all. A few months for the competition. I think finalists get 3 months to prepare a proposal. And then whammo, 2 years to create the statues, get all the approvals, get them cast in bronze and installed in the park. And the bronze casting process is hugely labor intensive. It takes 6, 7 months just to create in the foundry. So I have to be done sculpting. I had to be done sculpting by Thanksgiving before the August unveiling. So I had to start the figures at full size before we had complete approval. And the approval process was very fraught because there were people that felt that Stanton and Anthony were tainted by racism, that they should be characterized as racist, which I do not believe. They took quotations from them out of context, a sentence or two of really awful things that they said, awfully racist things. But there was a history to it of tremendous bitterness after the Civil War, where the women's rights movement had been put on hold to fight to end slavery, to fight to preserve the Union. And Anthony and Stanton thought they would get an amendment that would allow women to vote. And they were extremely upset. And the kind of ambient racism of the time pervaded them as well. But I don't think they should be, again, characterized by their flaws. I think they were heroines and women's rights pioneers. And so the city allowed us to add a third figure, which was kind of unprecedented. Central Park is full of one man on one block of granite statues. So 3 people on one pedestal. But they let us add Sojourner Truth, who worked with these women, who knew them. She was 20 years older than Susan B. Anthony, but they spoke at the same events. She was a guest at Stanton's house, and undoubtedly at some point they sat together at a table and had a good argument or a discussion, hammered out some speaking points. Who knows? But it is plausible that they sat together like this. And I wanted to show that the women's movement, that any social change is collective. It's a group effort. It's not one hero or heroine alone. So it's very important to me to show a group in discussion, in the act of creating change that way.
Well, they're just so beautifully detailed, and I know we don't have that much time to go into the details, but your detailing is extraordinary in terms of sharing their
Thank you.
stories. It's truly storytelling, your sculptures, and that's what I think for me a sculpture should represent versus just someone on a horse showing that they're going into war, which is of course a story too. That's sometimes extremely important. And there are so many women, including Marian Anderson with the Wonder Woman Project in Converse College, Spartanburg, South Carolina, as the first African American singer to perform at the New York City Met Opera and the White House. And I love how you're depicting her in that 1939 performance on the Lincoln Memorial steps on Easter Sunday in pose from her performance. Just curious how and who chose that work, who paid for it, how did that come to be? Only because why Marian Anderson at this particular university in South Carolina? That's 2005, I recall. Can you just touch on that, why you chose that subject and how it ended up coming to being?
Yes. Again, I didn't choose her. The music department chose her. It was for a series of great American women. And that college is very diverse, rather progressive, and all women, which is kind of interesting still. And an alumna from the college wanted this series of statues put up. And the sculptor who had organized that series of commissions saw my Boston Women's Memorial and got in touch with me to do this statue. And I knew about Marian Anderson from childhood. My parents had a copy of the World Book, which was the encyclopedia you got your kids. And of course, I looked up my birthday. And the night before I was born, Marian Anderson had broken the color barrier at the Metropolitan Opera. So I went to my parents and said, "What's the color barrier?" And that is how, as a small child, I learned about terrible segregation in cultural institutions. And she was already past her greatest age of singing when she sang that role. But boy, was that an amazing event.
I wish I could have been there for that moment. I remember being in Washington, D.C. in college, and my friend said to me, "Where are you going?" Never heard of that woman. And I went to Kennedy Center to see Mahalia Jackson. And I just always
Yes.
loved gospel. I had a woman that I called my other mother. Her name was Frances Hayes, and she raised us. She's from the South, from Jacksonville. And, she was very meaningful in my life. And so I went to Baptist church with her on Sundays. I think I was the only little
Hmm.
Jewish girl dressed up at Baptist church, but I loved the music and I loved the people. There's such community, and I loved Mahalia Jackson. I'm sure you're familiar with her.
Yes, I love her too. Yes. Well, there are recordings of Marian Anderson singing all kinds of spirituals and opera and art song. And Toscanini said, "This is a voice heard once in a century." I mean, she was a huge star in Europe. She came back to America, traveled around with her white Scandinavian pianist. And when they were traveling in the South, she had to sit on a bench outside the train station while he went in and got her a sandwich because she was Black. Meanwhile, German prisoners of war, this is during World War II, were being fed in the cafeteria inside the train station because they were white.
I'd like to say unbelievable, but this is true. And
No, no, it's all too believable, and there are people who want that all that back.
something is being done right now, hopefully, and things are changing.
Yes.
Speaking of someone who really needs to be spoken about because of her being such an exquisite writer, I know who I'm probably about to speak about. And she did not get her day here in America, but she did in Europe. And she was helped by her enslaved family. This is a guessing game right now, to be able to have a career and have an education. And she ended up having an extraordinary career and education. Unfortunately, I know it was a sad ending in the end. Once the husband and wife took care of her when they passed, she was married, and I don't think that worked out very well. And I understood she lost, at 31, she was the end of her life, and she lost two children, and her husband was a poor grocer. So what turned into being something quite glorious because of the people who actually took care of her and gave her an education, she ended up with nothing. Now, do you know which sculpture I'm speaking of? Meredith Bergmann.
Yes, you're speaking about Phyllis Wheatley, who unfortunately died young. And because the Boston Women's Memorial was three women, I made them three different ages. She's the young, beautiful one. And we don't know where she's buried. We don't know much about her husband or her marriage. We don't know the story, but we do know that she died soon after giving birth, and the child died with her. Her second book was never published. I think some poems have surfaced, but people are still looking for that manuscript. Her first book was published in England while she was still enslaved, but of course, the minute she got to England, legally she was free. And it was subsidized by a duchess, I think, and anyway, a British aristocrat. But she received word that the mother of the family that owned her in Boston, whose name was Wheatley, of course, Mrs. Wheatley was ill, and she took a ship and came back and helped nurse her in her final illness. And Mr. Wheatley eventually set her free. But there is again this terrible terribleness of slavery. There is this love and this ownership, this horrific ownership. And so it's very hard to understand now what the emotions in that household could have been. Did she feel love for these people? Did she feel loyalty? We don't know. And her poetry is very beautiful and is now finally really being studied as poetry.
Yes, I was speaking to the young lady that's working with me, Jessa, and she said that she just has always been so moved by her poetry and her as a woman who at 31 had already come so accomplished. And if it wasn't for her owners, so to speak, who actually had her stop doing domestic work so she could study and
Mm-hmm.
write and compete,
Yeah.
and they really were sort of very much her patrons in a way in the end.
Yes.
I also understand the name Phyllis came from the slave ship that she was on. That's how they gave her the name Phyllis.
That's such a terrible irony. She was named for the ship the Phyllis, on which she was brought, on which undoubtedly many people died. And the Wheatley family supported her. They also took her to tea at all the great houses in town so she could recite. And of course, they took her to the household of the Finch family, which owned the ship the Phyllis. So
My
there
God.
she was reciting poetry to the captain. of Phyllis. It makes my blood run cold.
Well, it makes me think
Just, oh,
that there is actually a God. Even though I'm not a religious person, I'm a spiritual person. I believe that that actually showed them that she overcame all this horrific history in her life and sadness and emptiness and turned it into something golden, or in your case, bronze. I think
well, I don't know if this is God, but it's certainly a kind of Holy Spirit in people to fight
yes.
always to overcome, to aim higher, to create more beauty in the world, and to try to overcome the horrors that they are subjected to by other people.
I just want to jump into, since we have a few more minutes, of course, the whole concept of the art world. I don't want to be negative on the art world, because without the art world, there would not be infrastructure for artists. There wouldn't be museums, galleries, foundations, supporters, patrons, people who go to art fairs, people who go to, small art events. It's very important to have the infrastructure. And in your case, it's an interesting and awkward question, because I wondered always whether race, color, gender should come into consideration when choosing an artist for a commission or a competition. Why white women are making black artists or black sculptures, or why black women are maybe, I don't even know of any black women, to be honest with you, or women of color that have made a white sculpture of a white woman. So I know it's a bit of an awkward question to ask, and I just thought of it a lot lately. Why does this happen? Why are women making sculptures of women and they don't really know their pain? We can feel it, but we don't know exactly, because you're obviously, you nor I am a black or woman of color. I'm just curious if you could
Well,
speak to
this
that.
this is a very fraught subject. Personally, I'm an individualist. I study individuals. I think about them within their solitude of self, as Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote about it, that each person is essentially alone to figure out the world. And I identify with that. And I have to, if I'm creating a portrait of someone, allow myself, give myself permission to identify with that subject, no matter how old they are, what gender they are, what race, what life experience. I have to study their life and try to find ways to understand and empathize with them. And that's a great pleasure of doing this kind of work, and very nourishing and very rewarding. And I wouldn't give that up for anything. So I seek out great themes and great people. And I believe that great people belong to all people, that I should be inspired by the struggle of people unlike myself. And I should be inspired by anyone who has struggled to overcome injustice and realize their best self. And I need to teach that to my son as well. So I try to kind of work in spite of some of these attitudes.
Well, I have to say, I mean, there are many great sculptors, and I have a wonderful Black History Month newsletter. If you haven't seen it, I'm going to send it to you. So many great Black
Thank you.
women sculptors, and I want to share that with you.
Well, Augusta Savage did sculpt white people. I know, I've seen some busts, so it's
Oh,
not
that's good to
unheard of.
know. Well, Simone Lee, who represented us, of course, this year in Venice, is extraordinary.
Yes,
And
wonderful. Yeah,
Wengetchi Mutu and Allison Sarr, who has here a sculpture here in New York City.
yes.
Vinnie
Vinnie
Bagwell,
Bagwell, yes.
who
Hmm.
I have interviewed for my podcast, Trailblazing Women. She
Yes,
has
she's
the
great.
Victory Beyond Sim sculpture that'll be in Central Park one of these days, which has been finished.
I'm
And
looking forward to that.
likewise, so we have some great African American, Black women, women of color who have made extraordinary strides in the art world and sculpture world, and are finally being recognized, which hats off to them, hats off to you. And I just want to thank you so
Thank you.
much and look forward to meeting you in the flesh when you're going to be in New York City the next time. And what do you have to say to artists, women artists, about trailblazing? If you could just wrap up about how do you continue down this trail and keep having the enthusiasm, the ambition, the drive? Just give us one pearl before you leave us.
I would just say follow what you love. And if it turns you away from some ambitions, it will help you learn who you are and what your scope can be. And just follow that.
Follow your heart, your soul, your body, And that's what I do every day when I wake up. And I want to thank you. I want to also thank my producer, Leah Bryant, and Jessa Mizrahi, and my mother, who brought me into the world, who is a trailblazing woman. I think all mothers are. And thank you for being a beautiful sculptor, a beautiful mother, and a great wife. And I guess a good sister and daughter.
Thank you, Cindy.
Thank you for your time.
I try. Thank you, Cindy. It's a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye now. Thanks so much for tuning in. Please subscribe and continue to experience groundbreaking stories as we blaze new trails together. Yours truly, Cindy Glanzrock, the Real Art Muse.